I wasn't really given much of a brief about what to actually talk about, so I thought I'd try and talk about something that might possibly maybe link with other stuff that we'll be talking about today. But people have already talked about this idea of appealing to multidisciplinary and cross-stakeholder approaches, so there's kind of some relevance in this talk and things that are considered good. I want to talk about loving your design data and why some of the stuff that you might be doing if you design software or work with software designers that you thought was bad might actually be good. You may hear GDPR mentioned, and you may see a link to the charter that Ryan mentioned, or at least an allusion to it. Public perceptions about security and privacy are hardening. People have said that, I wouldn't disagree, but what would the public think if they realise that the software that they're using, the design, is based on something like this? So a whole jumble of documents, we've got a requirement spec there, I think we've got an attack tree behind that bottle, a few spreadsheets and post-it notes with affinity diagrams for personas and UX models somewhere. That's actually where software designs actually come from. If anyone tells you it comes from a discrete UML model, they're basically lying to you, because that's really the origin of software design, and that's how we work, because we're all about agile. We want to get stuff to market quickly. And we haven't got time to curate stuff like this, but that's okay, because folks are telling us that the documentation is the code, or value code over documentation, which I guess is okay, but that premise has got a few problems. Number one, that argument is not going to make regulators very, very happy. If something harmful happens and the ICO rock up at your office, or the gambling commission, or the health and safety executive, and you say, well, here's actually our source code, it's first order logic, it tells you exactly what it does, that's not going to provide enough evidence that personal data was being protected, the software was being safe, or you are indeed compliant with any number of the slew of regulations you may have broken. Problem number two is software is too complex to reason about without some form of abstraction. So as much as we hate documents and models and we value code over everything else, sometimes we do need a picture over 1,000 words. Finally, relying on policies, security, education awareness, or training alone is not good enough, because we actually work in tech, and the whole thing about tech is that we kind of design tech in a way so it actually protects personal data, or it keeps you secure against bad things. So policies have a role, but if we're literally falling back on policies because we can't do anything else, then we've actually got a bit bigger problem. So we need to care about design, and we need to care about all this messy design data. But how can we get real value from it? Because we also want to get code out as well. Well, collaboration helps. Having people working together, doing low fidelity stuff, getting people talking, getting people out of the offices. And talking to each other is good. Here's an example of something we did several years ago. So we had to update a requirement specification for a government regulator that wanted to check that something was actually secure. Surprise, surprise, no one wants to update requirements documents. So what we did is we got our spec, we took out all the actual names for the requirements, and we wrote them on pieces of paper and put it on butcher paper, and we got all these folks who were involved with the requirements to actually stand up and tell me how all these things were related. Now John Lyle, who is now at Facebook, tells me people weren't actually unhappy; they were just cold. So that's the reason why people aren't particularly pleased here. But what this did is that it kind of got people to think maybe requirements aren't so bad. Maybe there is some value in it. But what we also found is that once we had these models, we could actually generate new specs based on them. So what this guy's doing here, he's using a tool called Graphiz, which is really a declarative language for taking tabular data and turning it into a graph. And what he's doing, he's turning the relationships between these pieces of paper into a text file and generating a model. So he imported that into a tool, and when we got something like this. So when we combine all these bits of data, we can start getting real value. We can start actually getting analytics. So we used a tool called curated. I'll talk a little bit about that later. What that was able to do was generate all these happy faces, which are really visualizations of requirements quality. The colors relate to traceability from the design data to code. We've got text-based colors here based on the priority of requirements, and people could see quite quickly what it was, what the state of the nation of their design was. And once they got engaged, they basically fell in love with their design data. But you can do more. I'm not going to go through this exercise. This is a data flow diagram for those people that don't know what it is. Some people might know what they are, but they probably are sitting a bit uncomfortably because DFDs are taught to undergraduates and they basically forget all about them because they don't realise they'll get any value. But for GDPR, it turns out they're really good because they actually map flows of data. So this is a very simple social network where all we do is update update friends data. And even with something like this, we can actually spot GDPR violations, assuming there are complementary models. So if we had time, I would actually ask you to spot the GDPR violations. But when we fed this into Kairos, we actually found about 7, and we would have found more if we hadn't modelled the informed consent relationships. I'll give you one example, which is quite insidious. So here we have a flow of data from a user who is updating a friends list, and we have a machine process here which is collating information from a social network database. So we got flows of information, but it turns out GDPR talks about storage limitations. So you're only storing data as long as you need it. And one of the things we found, and this is actually a model that was actually published as an example of methodology which it missed, was that this particular database wasn't just storing friends information, it was storing identifier information needed to get that friend information as well. And the problem was that data wasn't actually going anywhere. So although we have flows from the database to other places, that data is still sat around doing nothing, and that data is recognized as personal data, and consent has been given for that data to be there. So, even simple models like this can reveal violations. So, but before I end, and I am only sort of 6 minutes, by the way, according to this, doing all this stuff doesn't actually have to be expensive. These are all free tools. So spreadsheets might not be free if you're using Word, but I mean, OpenOffice is free. People generally know how to use spreadsheets, so you don't have to send people on a training course. You can export spreadsheets to text files, which means you can version them. They're really accessible via APIs. Graphiz is, I think, a killer app for doing any sort of data analytics. It's free. It visually structures stuff. Kairos is an open source tool that we actually maintain here at BU. If you import data into it, we can do some model analytics, visualizations, and general validation checks, as we've seen with the GDPR example, and we've got APIs. So before I finish, just want to do a bit of a plug that if you found this talk useful and you are a charity or you work with charities, we're organising a workshop here, actually literally here and next door, on GDPR and charity sector data protection impact assessments. So here's the URL. I'm organising this with my colleague Jane. So any questions about privacy and what we do, please speak to Jane. And happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Sorry I was very quick.